Today, as much as we revere the great lengths and the battles the Pilgrims traversed, one name sticks out with an evil ring and a dark shadow: John Billington. While others sought to build a new life founded on faith and community, Billington walked a path marred by conflict and rebellion. He was a man who stood apart, not for his piety or his perseverance, but for the strife he sowed among his fellow settlers. His name became synonymous with disobedience, a firebrand who challenged the colony's fragile order at every turn for his own benefit. His defiance reached its peak when he became the colony's first murderer, a crime so shocking it sealed his fate. Billington's execution, the first in Plymouth, left an indelible stain on the colony's early years. His name whispered with a mix of fear and disdain, a dark figure among the heroes of the New World. Details about this particular case are scant, and it's pretty obvious why. We're talking about events that occurred in the 15 and the 1600s. The Mayflower is only so well documented because of the implications it had for the United States. Not much is known about John Billington's early life, other than he married a woman named Eleanor. He was born in 1580, and he had 2 sons prior to joining the Mayflower crew. We can deduce that he had the skills of a homesteader. He had some sort of skill that the Pilgrims deemed valuable enough to take him along, even though he did not share the same religious conviction that most of them had. He had 2 children, one named Francis, the other named John Jr. They are very relevant in how most of the Mayflower crew saw Billington before he even arrived, and this is primarily because of an incident that occurred right on the Mayflower. Now, his son Francis was just a regular 14-year-old boy, and when you're on a boat and you're on it for months and you're not eating very much, you get bored. All you do is your chores or whatever they're telling you, and you're probably praying all the time, and there's nothing to do. So Francis one day picks up a musket and he tries to load it and he fires it. And this nearly hits a gunpowder barrel. Now, this could have blown up the entire ship, killing everybody aboard, which if that had been the case, much of our history as a nation wouldn't exist. So him missing that gunpowder changed history. And it definitely changed the way most of the other passengers saw Billington. They kind of viewed him as a black sheep after that. And I'm sure Billington held some resentment as well, because his son was demonized after that. And they all were treated very poorly after that. So this event probably contributed to what Billington would go later on to do. Now, ironically, their trip took around 66 days, which is the devil's number, which I thought was pretty neat. But basically, they left England at around September 6th, and they arrived November 9th in Plymouth, where they would make their new colony. Nothing else of note would really occur with Billington on that trip, but that one incident probably affected him and his family and how they saw the Pilgrims and how the Pilgrims saw them to such an extent that they were never able to really reintegrate into the community in a way that was healthy. And Billington would have many more arguments later on with the leaders of the community and how things were run, and this would all come head to head. But in terms of what he had to go through the same trials and tribulations that the other Pilgrims had to go through. This would include overcrowding, lack of resources, harsh storms, uncertainty about the location, and just the general stress of seasickness. The leader of this colony is known as John Carver. right? He is the governor of Plymouth, right? He is the leader of the Pilgrims. And Billington doesn't really like him. He's been here about a year and he feels like Carver is pushing him around and making him do a bunch of stupid stuff. So he decides that he is going to publicly roast the governor. Now, nowadays, you can say whatever you want about Trump, Kamala, or whoever the hell you're talking about. Nobody cares. Or maybe they do. But back then, this was not taken very well. You weren't allowed to talk about the governor. I guess freedom of speech wasn't really one of the founding principles that Plymouth, the colony of the Pilgrims, was going to be founded on. It was going to be founded on religious liberty, I suppose. So this leads to him being censured, which basically means that if he spoke out again, he would get a very harsh punishment, which could include exile, it could include execution, or it could include a public whipping, which none of those sound very appealing, at least to me. So I would have to say this would be his first sort of incident with the leadership. Now, this might all sound a bit tough, and you're right, it was very tough. They had so many struggles. They had to deal with the winter, they had to deal with a lack of food, they had to deal with disease. So the last thing they needed is infighting. Now, in John Carver's favor, right, as a leader, he showed a high level of temperament. And I base this off of the fact that he had many reasons to not like John Billington. John Billington was not like the other pilgrims. He did not hold their religious belief, which was the primary reason why these pilgrims left England, to escape this religious persecution. John Billington's son nearly blew up the ship and killed everybody aboard. So he had that he to also not like Billington. So aside from speaking out, Governor John Carver showed a level of restraint when he pardons John Billington. So in 1624, Billington has another incident. So this is 3 years later, and this is after the colony is experiencing a food shortage. This is after some people have died of disease. So this is when the colony is at its weakest. He attempts to rile up people so that he can overthrow the colony and become the leader. The only problem with this is not enough people like John Billington. He's not that popular. He's like that kid in school who thinks he's one of the cool kids because he's wearing a new pair of shoes. But everybody looks around and they're like, this guy's a total douche. So the year is now 1630, and John Billington should be at around 50 years old. So you'd think that he'd be settling down and just not doing any more crazy things like trying to start a rebellion or roasting the governor. But no, Johnny Boy decides that it's a good idea to kill one of his neighbors over a property dispute. So these two had apparently had a long-time feud. It's not exactly known what the feud was about, but the details are pretty clear that it was not up for debate whether John Billington shot John Comyn. After this, he is taken in immediately for trial. So William Bradford would be in charge of this trial, and this is because he was the governor at the time. And so he leads the tribunal, and based on the evidence he's presented, which was likely witness testimony, he determines that John Billington must die, and John Billington is then promptly hanged on September 30th, 1630. So this case obviously held great moral weight on the original colonies and colonial law, and this case would also lead to many other implications. It would be referenced as one of the ways that they established law and order in this country. His last legacy on our nation, I suppose, is actual descendants. One of his descendants would go on to be the President of the United States. James A. Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, who was assassinated in 1881, was a direct descendant of John Billington, which I thought was really cool. And so, this is where our story ends.